All right. So for Wednesday, I'm going to be introducing our first novel of the semester. So apart from the little short stories that I showed you around the narrative time, we haven't done much reading so far. So I want to kick that into gear now that we've introduced grammar and writing. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of books is banned and challenged books. So here I have a list of the top 100 banned and challenged books from 2000 to 2009. Now they are coming out with a new list this year, and it will cover 2010 to 2019. But they're not coming out with the list until later on in September. So I wanted to go ahead and show you this list. And whenever the updated one comes out, then we can talk about the updated books that are on that list. Now, when I say banned or challenged, a book can only be banned or challenged from a public arena. So that would be a public school system, a public library, somewhere where people could go in and get a copy of the book without necessarily having to pay for it. They could check it out. So this does not ban books from bookstores. You could still go and buy any of these books in a bookstore or on Amazon. But in certain places, you cannot read these books in school, or you would not be able to check them out of a public library because they have been challenged or banned by that area. And usually it's only a specific area, typically limited to a county. So a challenge would not affect another county. It would just affect that one particular county. So as you're looking through these, I'm sure there's some that are surprising, some names that you recognize. Maybe others are less surprising. You see the names and you're like, well, I guess I can see why they can't read that in school. But some of them I'm sure are ones that you maybe even have read before in other classes. And you're like, wait, what? We read that in 8th grade or whatever. So I'm going to talk about just a few reasons why some of these books ended up on this list. And if there's others that I don't address, feel free to email me or talk to me the next day when we have class and be like, well, wait, I was really wondering about this one. So first up, Harry Potter. So a lot of people now obviously, don't remember or weren't alive for the controversy that surrounded Harry Potter when it first came out. J.K. Rowling, suffered a lot of people who said that her books were promoting witchcraft and that if you read them, you would become little witches and warlocks. And in fact, George W. Bush, who was our president at the time, refused to give J.K. Rowling the Presidential Medal of Freedom because he thought the Harry Potter series promoted witchcraft. So it was a serious concern back in the day. A lot of the fervor has died down, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Harry Potter drop on this list now that many years have gone by. Let's see, some other ones. Okay, so number 4 on the list, and Tango Makes 3, is actually a children's book. It is a children's book about 2 penguins who adopt a baby penguin named Tango. Now, you may be wondering, well, what on earth could be controversial about penguins? Why are they number 4 on this list? Well, the 2 penguins who adopted Tango were both male penguins. So a lot of controversy surrounded that because many parents saw that as promoting homosexuality for their children, and they had this book banned and challenged so that their elementary school age children would not see a normalized relationship between 2 males, even if it's just 2 male penguins. It's based on an actual story. They didn't just make up the penguins, but anyway, so that's one reason why that one is on there. Let's see some other ones. Of Mice and Men, lots of bad language and violence in that one. Can't have you guys exposed to that. That would be bad. I believe they're coming out with a movie version of his Dark Materials. Well, it was probably supposed to be sometime this year. Who knows when that'll be? But there was some charges of blasphemy in that one, questioning God. The Perks of Being a Wallflower, there is a movie version, actually, with one of the actresses who is known for Harry Potter. And that one has drug use, violence, homosexuality, lots of things that people had objections to. I know there's another one, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but anyways, lots of controversial things in there. Let's see, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is one that has been banned repeatedly. People accused it of being racially insensitive. It has racial slurs in it. It was set during slavery, so, it's probably not shocking that some of those things are in there given the time period, but a lot of people feel that those sorts of that sort of material shouldn't be read in a contemporary sense either. Let's see. Now, number 17 is interesting, The Color Purple. It is interesting because I know for a fact that this book was challenged in Yadkin County. So the year before I started teaching, so this would have been about 10 years ago, The Color Purple was assigned as summer reading for incoming honors freshmen. And very quickly, a parent went up to the office and said, there's absolutely no way that my son is reading this book. Just to give you some context, The Color Purple begins with a rape scene. So obviously there's some very, sensitive, controversial material in there. And, this father felt like, my student is not at the age where they need to be confronting this controversial material, where they need to learn about that sort of thing. So, though there are many copies of The Color Purple back in the book room, nobody reads it. It has remained unread for many years. Now, number 18, Go Ask Alice. That should sound familiar. We read the one diary entry where Alice did drugs for the first time. So you can probably guess that drug use is the number one reason why Go Ask Alice is on that list. All right. Catcher in the Rye, another one with lots and lots of bad language in it. The Giver, I usually get a lot of questions about this because some of you have read it or you've seen the movie, which came out a few years ago. Not to spoil anything, but the way that the unnecessary members of society were dealt with in The Giver was felt to be very controversial. So if you've read the book, I think you'll know what I mean. But let's see. My Brother Sam is Dead. That was set during the Civil War, I believe. So there were some accusations that the book was too violent for kids to read, and also that it was unpatriotic. Bridge to Terabithia is another one I get a lot of questions about. If you've read the book, again, don't want to spoil anything for those who haven't, but the death that was in the book was felt to be very traumatic. And the alternate world that the kids would play in was felt to promote the occult and Satanism. So I don't know if I can say I agree with that one, but that was the objection as cited by the area that had an issue with it. Let's see what else is well known. The Kite Runner is actually one that you will read your senior year if you have Mr. Buter. He teaches that one every year. And that was full of a lot of violence. It was set in the Middle East. There was a lot of violence in it. And there was also a rape scene in there. Let's see, what else? Summer of My German Soldier takes place during World War II. So there was a very violent, abusive parent-child relationship in it, and also accusations of racism against Jewish people because of the time period that it was set in. Let's see, what else? Controversial ones that I've read before. Fahrenheit 451. I actually teach that to my juniors. Kind of a dystopian society where the government has taken control of things, and society is sort of checked out, and they just sit around and watch TV all day. And eventually, you have a character who kind of rebels against that. So, promoting that rebellion was one of the reasons that one became controversial. Let's see, The Lovely Bones. I usually get questions about this one. If you've seen the movie but haven't read the book, there are a few other things in the book that people felt were controversial. But the listed reason was that it was just too frightening. There wasn't too much detail aside from that. You can probably guess why that book made the list. Let's see. Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, I'll get questions about sometimes. You'll see Chris Crutcher's name a couple times on this list. He really likes to write controversial books that deal with real teenage issues. So in this book, the issue of abortion comes up in the book. There's a class discussion about abortion. There's a very abusive parent-child relationship once again. Let's see, there's a discussion about homosexuality. There's a character who comes out as gay. So all of those controversial things definitely made that one make the list. The Handmaid's Tale has become more popular over the last few years because of the TV series. Again, kind of dystopian world, government has taken over, and lots of violence and rebellion and things. I was going to ask about Friday Night Lights, which is a lovely movie, good book. There are some racial issues in Friday Night Lights, as well as bad language. So that is what put that one on the list. Also an abusive relationship in there, I believe, as well. So A Wrinkle in Time, I've gotten asked about recently since the movie came out. And that one kind of is in the same boat as Harry Potter. The presence of the witches in A Wrinkle in Time was felt to promote Satanism. So, yeah. Goosebumps is another one I get asked about a lot. I used to read those as a kid, but I suspect they were probably banned from elementary school or an elementary school library, if I had to guess, just because of the fear aspect. They were described as, quote, too scary. Also, someone in one of the objections said it was promoting the occult / Satanism, I think. But yeah, I missed that one. But anyways, so that's just a few of the reasons why some of these books have been so controversial. And you can see that To Kill a Mockingbird is on this list, number 21. Now, To Kill a Mockingbird was published back in the 1960s, but decades later, it's still showing up on banned books lists from 2000 to 2009. And there's a few reasons for that. So for one, there is some bad language in there. There are some characters, typically not very admirable folks, who say some bad things, just kind of general bad language, as well as some racial slurs. It is set during segregation. So that is, a very racially charged time back in the 1930s. There is some violence, and there is an accusation of rape in the book. So those are just a few of the issues that have gotten that kicked off over the years. And even as recently as 2004 in Durham, North Carolina, they banned To Kill a Mockingbird. In 2016 in Virginia, they banned To Kill a Mockingbird. So it's not one that has totally outlived its controversy. It is still causing controversy to this day, for sure. So on that note, I will now introduce you to your book and your author. So Harper Lee, her full name was Nell Harper Lee, but she went by Harper Lee because her publisher told her that her book would be more likely to sell if it sounded like it was written by a man. So when people see Harper Lee on the front of the book, they would not immediately know that a woman was responsible for that book, and it would be more successful. And it actually was very successful. So she was born just before the Great Depression hit in Monroeville, Alabama, down in the Deep South. She published To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960. It has never been out of print. It has been consistently in demand since then. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2007 by George W. Bush. He described her novel as a gift to the entire world and one that has influenced the character of our country for the better. And here she is in 2007 getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Isn't she cute? So she has passed away since then, a few years back. But she lived a nice long life and was definitely praised for this novel, which is one of the only ones that she ever published. Now, the novel is also set in Alabama. It is set in the town of Macomb, Alabama. Now, a lot of people believe that Macomb, Alabama is really meant to represent Monroeville, Alabama, but Harper Lee wanted to avoid people getting worked up or upset about their small town being portrayed in the book, so she set it in a fictional town instead. So the reason that this looks so cartoony is this is someone's kind of reconstruction of what the town looked like based on the description that she gives in the novel, since it is not a real town. So in the main square of town, you have cafes and drugstores and the jail, the bank, the post office, the courthouse. And then a little ways from the main square, this kind of concentrated area is where most of our major characters live. The characters who will get the most face time are in the Finch family. So Atticus Finch and his children are going to get the most attention. And then some of their neighbors will feature in various sections of the book as well. Since there are children, they will, of course, go to school. So we have the elementary school and the high school. They did not have middle school back in Alabama in the 1930s. We will also feature this family called the Radleys. And there's some nice trees and things, and some directions to other more remote areas of the county. Now, I mentioned that the book took place during the 1930s. So if you know anything about history, that was the Great Depression. So for our novel, we are concerned about a lot of historical issues. So during the Great Depression, obviously, we have a lot of economic disparities. We have people who are suffering and struggling through a terrible time for our economy. We also have a lot of prejudice and legal segregation, the separate but equal doctrine that existed in the 1930s. And education, it was not the greatest in the 1930s. There was still widespread illiteracy and ignorance, and that definitely compounds some of our issues. So I mentioned that we were set in Macomb, Alabama, which is probably a substitute for Monroeville, Alabama. So you can see the little bitty town of Monroeville down there. So it's not too far from Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, but it is in the deep south, way, way, way down near the bottom of Alabama. Now, Macomb itself, since it's fictional, here's that map, and the larger, easier to see version is on canvas. History-wise, 1929 was when our stock market crashed, and our book is going to take place at the beginning of 1933, I believe it is. So the Great Depression has been going on for a bit. Businesses are suffering. Most people, who had a factory-based job ended up losing their job because factories closed. And even the people who still had some money still suffered because production was so heavily impaired. A lot of really poor people lost their homes. They had to live off the land, live wherever they could, do whatever they could to get by. I mentioned that education wasn't the greatest, so this was a little Alabama school in the 1930s. It was not uncommon to have kind of single building schools, maybe multiple grades in a classroom in very isolated areas. They would use firewood in here to, keep themselves warm during the winter, and they would do the best they could. Teacher would do the best that she could to try to give them a basic education, in spite of other conflicting responsibilities they might have had at home or on the farm. One particular type of farmer that you saw a lot during the Great Depression was sharecroppers. So sharecroppers were farmers who farmed land that they did not own. So typically someone else farmed or owned the land and they would farm it for them. It was a very rough way of living because you were not guaranteed money. You were guaranteed a percentage of the profits. And if things didn't go well, that was a bad year. Now, at the time, the president situation was kind of in flux. So Herbert Hoover became president around the time that the Great Depression hit. And even though, it wasn't his fault or anything, we don't blame him for it happening, the way that he handled it was not ideal. So from 1929 to 1933, there was a great deal of suffering, and a lot of people laid that suffering at Herbert Hoover's feet for not doing more to counteract the Great Depression. Now, FDR, on the other hand, is one of our most popular presidents in United States history. He's the only president who was elected for 3 terms. They enacted the 2-term limit because of FDR. They were so worried he'd be so popular and get elected forever. So he was president for a long time. And back in 1933, he gave a very famous inaugural speech in March of 1933. And he said that this Great Depression was tough, but we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that quote is how we know that our book starts in 1933, because on page 6 of the book, they tell us that Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. All right, so social class-wise, we are kind of used to having the most wealthy people be the smallest percentage of the population, but the definition of what wealthy was back in the 1930s in southern Alabama definitely is different from what it is now. So the Finch family, who we are going to be following, they would not be wealthy by our definition, for sure, but in the 1930s, Great Depression time, they had food on the table every night. The father is a lawyer, so he has a consistent income. So they're doing pretty great. They have a car that was unusual for Alabama in the 1930s. So they would be much better off than a lot of these other folks. The country folk, there are quite a few country folk in rural Alabama. Is represented by a family called the Cunninghams. And these would be folks who, they are barely getting by. They may not have food to put on the table because they're trying to farm their land and trying not to lose their land. But they do work for what they have. Now there's another family, the Ewell family, who is meant to represent kind of the white trash of the community. These are people who do not necessarily work for a living. They relied solely on government assistance. The father in the Ewell family is an alcoholic who does not provide well for his children. So that is kind of the flip side of the coin to the Cunninghams. And then the African American community would have been one of the largest communities, but still seen as inferior socially because of the racial injustice and the prejudice during this time period. And there's an individual named Tom Robinson, and he will kind of represent this community to us and bring this community into focus in the book. Okay, so I've hinted at it a lot. Now we got to talk about it a little bit more. Slavery ended in 1864. I don't want anyone the entire time we are reading this book to say that a character is a slave. No. Slavery is over with. But the way that people lived and the way that they were treated and the way that they were disrespected, it wasn't a whole lot better. People still held on to a lot of prejudice and discrimination and believed that African Americans were inferior to white people. So separate but equal was a way for them to kind of police that. So they would have cabins that were designated as colored only cabins, waiting rooms that were white only waiting rooms, basically all public places, theaters, doctors' offices, lunch counters, buses. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the bus boycott as a result of Rosa Parks saying, "No, I will not move." So those were some of the areas where they could expect to be segregated from white people because of white people's distaste for people of color. Now, the reason that this came about is because of the Jim Crow laws. Even the name Jim Crow is actually an incredibly racist name for these laws. There was a song that was written before the Civil War, and it was a depiction of a poor and uneducated rural black, a depiction of a person of color in a way that they felt showed their inferiority. So the name of this law even is actually incredibly discriminatory. And Jim Crow laws regulated these separate use of areas. And the belief system that led to the Jim Crow system was an incredibly racist belief system. So at that time, they believed that whites were superior to blacks. They were superior in terms of intelligence, in terms of morality, in terms of civilized behavior, just innately, genetically or something, somehow they thought that whites had an advantage in those areas. They believed that sexual relations between blacks and whites must be discouraged. It would produce a mongrel race which would destroy America. Yes, that is an exact quote. And I find that especially ironic considering who our president was before President Trump. And, America hasn't been destroyed yet, so I think we're doing okay. They did not want to treat blacks as equals because of their concern about sexual relations. And if necessary, they would frequently use violence to try to keep people in their place. It was acts of domestic terrorism to create fear and oppress minorities. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, partially because they make me kind of sick, but just to really give you an idea, how horrific it was for people of color, particularly in the South. The rules of etiquette governed everything. A black male could not offer his hand to shake hands with a white male because it implied being socially equal. Courtesy titles. If you were a person of color, you would typically be referred to by your first name, or maybe called something like boy or something like that. But you would be required to use a courtesy title, Mr. or Mrs. somebody, when you were referring to a white person. You would never be called Miss or Sir or Ma'am. And then this one just seems downright unsafe. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections. Now, I know some of you all haven't been through driver's education yet, but that just does not seem like a logical sort of thing to check the race of everyone at a four-way stop and decide who gets to go first. But conversational rules, of course, white people don't lie, so they could never even suggest that a white person was lying. If you were a person of color, you could not say that. You could never demonstrate superior intelligence. That would be considered rude or disrespectful. Never laugh at a white person. And then this one got cut off, but never comment upon the appearance of a white female. And there are quite a few instances of violence carried out against people of color, particularly men of color, because of perceived flirtations or sexual aggression towards white women. Now, the way that this all started to fall apart, the way that segregation finally started to be dismantled was through this first mass civil rights movement. So one thing that really kicked things off was the desegregation of public schools. That started to allow people to press for desegregation in other areas. Rosa Parks, who spawned the bus boycott that economically crippled the bus system in Montgomery and allowed for some change in that area. Now, in the middle of all this, you can see To Kill a Mockingbird is there, and it went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list because a lot of people were ready for change. They were ready to leave these horrifically racist rules behind and progress as a nation. They made a movie of To Kill a Mockingbird just a year later, Academy Award nominations. So a lot of people believe that, the way that To Kill a Mockingbird was situated, that it may have helped assist the civil rights movement by creating these really negative depictions of racist behavior. In 1963, there was a massive civil rights march, and that was where we had the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and progress continued to be made. The 1965 Voting Rights Act came soon after, and there was a lot of progress, legal progress. Can't change everyone's mind, of course, but legal progress was made. Now, other issues that we'll see in the book, back in the 1930s, there was still a lot of gender bias. Women were considered weak, physically, mentally, emotionally. We just were kind of fragile. Women were generally not educated for occupations outside the home. And in wealthy families, our primary job was to oversee the servants and entertain guests. But gender bias does work both ways, and back in this time, men were not considered capable of nurturing children. It was extremely rare to have a single father household. Some legal issues that are going to impact our stories. Women were given the vote in 1920, 100 years ago. But in the 1930s, juries were almost always male and white. You typically did not have women, and you did not have people of color who served on juries. And I mentioned that, white people didn't lie back in the day. Fair trial did not include acceptance of a black man's word against a white man's. If there was no other physical evidence, if it came down solely to witness testimony, it was kind of a foregone conclusion about how that would turn out. So, to sum up, we have a lot of prejudice in this novel. Racial prejudice, first and foremost, but a great deal of gender prejudice, social class prejudice, age prejudice, a little bit of religious prejudice thrown in there just for good measure. But yeah, so there is quite a lot of controversy in To Kill a Mockingbird for sure. Okay, now the next thing that I have is a copy of, if it'll ever open, the book itself. So To Kill a Mockingbird, we have physical copies for in class, but obviously some of you will be doing a lot of reading not in class. So here is a PDF version of the book. The chapters are the same. The page numbers obviously will differ, but the chapters are the same. So you'll be able to read it online. And in a lot of my videos, I'll read certain sections out loud so that you can listen to me read instead of having to read it all yourself. So that is there, that online copy of the book. Another thing that we will have to help keep us organized is this graphic organizer. And at this time, and I'm going to do it with you, I strongly recommend that you copy and paste this into a document. It has all of our major characters for part 1 of the novel. So it is a good way to stay organized about character information. So we'll make note of how they connect to other characters. We'll also talk about information that is directly revealed to us about them, as well as indirectly revealed to us about them. So I recommend that you create a document and try to paste your graphic organizer in the document. If it does not paste the same way that it looks on Canvas, then let me know. Sometimes we have technical difficulties. Every once in a while, someone tries to paste their graphic organizer and it ends up 12 pages long. So feel free to get rid of any extra junk that's gotten put along with that. Okay, so here's my graphic organizer, and I'm going to title my graphic organizer Graphic Organizer. And that way, when I talk about characters, I can type in the information, and you can type in your information, and you will have all of this information by the end of part 1, which will be when this graphic organizer is due. Make sure when you're copying it, you get all the way down to Tom Robinson. So he will be the last character on there. Okay, the only other thing I have to show you for today is just to let you look at what your questions are going to be like. Now, if you're in class, I will ask you to, pay attention with us while we're reading. And once we're done reading, you'll have some time to work on questions and catch up on this information. If you are working remotely, obviously feel free to, while you're watching my videos, pause and, get down information as it comes up, so that you don't have to worry about that later on when you might forget it. So if you want to go ahead and copy and paste these questions into a document, do not put it in this same graphic organizer document because they're not due at the same time, but you could create a new document for the To Kill a Mockingbird questions. And if you're feeling ambitious, you might even be able to go ahead and answer number 1, because I talked about that town, the town that To Kill a Mockingbird is set in, quite a bit in my presentation today. So you could just go ahead and have number 1 done. All right. Whew. So that was a lot of information, but hopefully that gave you a really thorough introduction into To Kill a Mockingbird, what it's going to be about, what's going to be controversial about it, and hopefully that has prepared you for when we start the book later this week.